Hello, everybody. Long time regular viewers of the show know we've been running a series on Financial Times Books of the Year on economics. They're down to a short list of 6. We're going to cover all of them. And actually, in the next couple of days, I have a conversation with the British economist Daniel Susskind. He has a book on growth, a history and a reckoning. And like so many other contemporary economists and sociologists and political theorists, he questions the idea of political growth. Political growth, economic growth. Growth for him is a question mark. That's why the subtitle of his book is A History and a Reckoning. My guest today, I think, has no problems with the idea of growth. His book has been very well reviewed in the Financial Times. It's not on the short list of 2024 books. Maybe it'll make the short list for next year. The book is called Return to Growth. And its author is Jon Moynihan, who's a very distinguished politician, economist, thinker, and he's joining us from his home in Chelsea. Jon, congratulations on the book. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I'm not sure if you've seen Susskind's book on growth. I assume you don't have any problems with the idea of growth. For you, it's by definition a good thing.
I mean, funnily enough, I know both of the Susskinds, father and son. Yours is
They're
the
two
son.
sons, actually. One of the other sons is a digital technology expert.
Well, this son and his father were both associated with Balliol College, Oxford, that I also went to and had a lot to do with over the years. So I knew them both. It's the most left-wing college in Oxford, and there's a lot of stuff that I feel is fairly magical thinking about how we don't need. Tell that to the couple of billion people around the world who are living in poverty right now, that they don't need growth. Of course they need growth. And there are many, many countries around the world that are far richer than we have here in the UK. And are continuing. It's no problem, and it's very good for the people. And it's all very well if you're a relatively pampered Oxford don living the life of ease to say that more growth is a bad thing. But try and tell that for somebody who's just starting out in life, who's going to get married and have kids, provide for them, and is going to want to make their life better. If you say there's no growth, you basically wipe out all their aspirations. And I go into that in the book quite a lot. I am very anti those who are anti-growth. I think it's magical thinking in its own way.
Well, you've given me a wonderful blurb, Jon, to introduce my conversation with Daniel Susskind. Maybe we can do a debate between the two of you. So you don't acknowledge any credibility in the arguments. Maybe they're on the left, amongst progressives, certainly for environmentalists. Some of them are actually in their own way quite conservative about some of the consequences of growth, particularly when it comes to global warming. For you, is that just irrelevant?
Well, you can argue about global warming, but if you believe that the temperature of the planet is going up because there is more and more carbon going into the air, the nation that has reduced its carbon emissions the most is the United States, and it's done that by fracking, which has allowed it to get rid of most of its coal-fired plants and move to gas turbines for generation of electricity. And because gas doesn't have much of a carbon footprint of carbon that the US puts into the air has declined dramatically. And the US is growing at a very satisfactory rate and bringing happiness to its people as a result. You say, would I have a debate? Don't I give them any credit? Well, I'm content to make the case for growth, and I think I make a reasonably powerful case for it. If you say there should be no growth, then you're saying to somebody that if you want to better your life at all, if you want a raise next year, if you want a better job next year, then you're going to do it at the expense of somebody else who will have an equal and opposite loss to your kind of moral way to go about the world, particularly when we can all gain. I mean, the human potential is infinite, and one should believe in human potential.
Let's focus on UK growth, because as you've noted, some countries are doing better than others. The US economy, maybe not its democracy, seems to be in very good shape. Before this interview, John, I ran the question of the UK economy in decline through AI, through Google, which of course is an American rather than British product. And there seems to be a consensus that UK suffers from low growth, if not negative growth. Give us some numbers. What is what in a nutshell is the last 25-year history of British economics? Has it been one of dismal decline?
Well, just if I can say a couple of words at first, that I lived for a couple of decades in New York, and I'm very pro-America. So this is not an anti-American remark, but AI was originally invented by guys coming out of DeepMind, which was a British company. Just to I need, as a patriot, to say nice, but obviously, as it with so many other technologies, it's been taken over by America and made much better there.
I mean, just to come back on that, John, I don't
Yeah.
think there's anyone. I'm in Silicon Valley. I don't think there's anyone here, including the people at DeepMind, who would claim that they invented AI.
No, quite. ChatGPT, whatever.
Well, ChatGPT was an open AI, not a DeepMind's product. But anyway.
Yeah. Okay. You're probably right on that particular point. I think the characterization that your AI and yourself just gave the British economy is pretty much correct. For the last couple of decades, things have gone very badly wrong in the UK. The average wage is 5% lower in real terms than it was 17 years ago. And what the book shows is that this is completely predictable as a result of the economic policies that have been adopted by various UK governments of both parties, Labour and Conservative, equivalent of Democrat and Republican. They've steadily increased. They steadily attempted to increase the size of the tax take. They've had significantly higher and higher deficits, and they have massively piled regulation upon regulation on business. And the kinds of tax that are the taxes on business, which are exactly the ones that prevent economic growth. So as a result, both parties are complicit in having done exactly those things that many economists of all stripes would lead to lower and lower economic growth. And we've had our budget here yesterday, Andrew, which is where the Chancellor of the Exchequer, equivalent, I suppose, of Secretary of Treasury or something like that, lays out what the economic policies are going to be.
Rachel Reeves, and the
FT
today was asking whether it misled the UK public. So there's some questions on that.
Yes, and in fact, normally the FT is reasonably positive towards the left-wing parties, but regardless of whether she misled the public or not, the policies that she announced it's quite good for my book, really, although not great for the country. Every single policy just about is the precise opposite of what the book recommends to keep economic growth going.
Although, to be fair to the government, The Guardian, which is of course a pro-Labour newspaper, has a headline about Starmer, your current Prime Minister, insisting on what he calls pro-growth policies. So all politicians are always in favour of growth, whether it actually results in growth. Let me pick up on one thing, John, and we're going to talk a lot more about taxation and government regulation. But coming back to your point about DeepMinds, which was, as you say, a British company that was acquired by Google,
Yes.
and now is one of the motors of a perhaps $3 trillion company, an American company, AI being its increasingly central innovation, its most valuable product. Are you suggesting, I'm not sure of the exact date when DeepMind was acquired by Google, it's probably around 8 or 10 years ago, certainly in the time period you're talking about. Are you suggesting that had government policies been different, had there been less government regulation, lower taxes, DeepMind wouldn't have ended up being acquired by an American company?
It's a good question, Andrew. I certainly wasn't suggesting that and wasn't thinking that, but it's a very good question as to whether it's the case or not. There are so many things that you have to untangle to understand this sort of thing. But so, for example, the London Stock Exchange is in a state of desperation right now, and very few companies are able to come to market. They tend to have to hop over to New York, and that ends up with the company moving out of the UK and being in America. And the reason for that is, for example, that they wrote laws that directed the money of all the pension funds into government bonds about 2005, I think, or maybe it's 2004. And obviously that's great for government bonds if all the pension fund money is propping up the bond market, but it's terrible for equities. So at that time, about 6 of UK pension fund money was in the London Stock Exchange. Now it's 4%. So that's an example of one of many, many things that have led to it being very difficult for companies to grow large in the UK. Another example, for example, is that there's a thing called the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the regulator for the City of London, who have said that you must have a so-called ESG statement, and you know all about ESG, I guess, and you have to have a policy on it, and you have to once a year on how you're doing on it, ESG, if you want to be listed on the London Stock Exchange. Now, imagine if you were required to submit a personal report on how you were doing on ESG in order to have a bank account or whatever, and you could go and find a bank that didn't require you to do that, you'd probably go to that other bank, however keen you were on ESG. And so it is with British companies. They all hop over to the US because none of them are particularly interested in having all their time taken up on these foolish requirements. So it's as the book goes on about, it's the size of government, the size of taxes, but also the number of regulations, many of them really foolish, that people have to endure here, that is stopping companies from growing here, and therefore there's no economic.
Yeah, it's volume 1. I'm not sure you answered my question, but anyway,
What was the question?
well, the question was
Could we
about whether or not, I mean, I take your point on ESGs. Again, it's not my area of expertise. Some people might disagree, but it's hard to imagine that had that policy on ESGs been different, then DeepMinds would have remained an independent British company.
Remember I said it was a whole bunch of stuff, and I gave a couple of examples. It's just very difficult to grow a company to size here. Now we did with, for example, ARM, the chip manufacturer. They managed to stay within the enormous in size, although I think they are listed on the London Stock Exchange, but most of their work is done over here in Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. But I mean, obviously, America has very, very deep capital pockets, and as where you are, Silicon Valley is prepared to take very large bets and has a huge pool of capital that allow it to scoop up companies, whether in the UK or elsewhere. So it's always difficult.
Right. It's complicated.
Yeah.
There is, of course, the politics to this. You're also a life peer. You're a conservative. Is there a political dimension to this? You talked about the recent past, John. Is it perhaps more than coincidental that you seem to date all this back to the Blair government? You suggested that the Conservatives are also responsible. When did all this begin?
Well, I mean, what I say is that if we could return as a country to the kind of economy that Tony Blair had, Labour, at the turn of the millennium, that would be enough to have quite satisfactory growth, which indeed we did have back then. Blair's government expenditure was about 1/3 of the economy, and now we're up to nearly 1/2 of that. And in fact, in my book, I mostly blame the Conservatives for that, although I also blame Blair's successor, Gordon Brown. I may take the Conservative whip because it's the political grouping nearest to my views, but I wouldn't say that I agree with the majority of what the Conservative governments did in the 14 years they were in power until earlier this year. And I've always been a critic of what they did.
Are
So
you?
I'm an
How would
equal
you describe
opportunity.
your economic thinking? I mean, of course, the person who looms over all this debate about government expenditure and economics and growth is Mrs. Thatcher. Are you a Thatcherite, which often is used as an insult? I don't mean it as one, John.
No, not at all. And among my gang, it's not in the least thought of as an insult. It would be a high honor to be called a Thatcherite. I go along with an awful lot of her policies. There's a lot of stuff that she didn't dare touch, like education, which I think is really important to sort out. And she didn't go after our socialistic health system here, which also needs sorting out. What people of my stripe.
That's not going to win you a lot of friends, John. I mean, when you're saying you
Well,
should get rid of
I'm
the
not. I'm
National
not
Health
here.
Service.
I'm not here to win friends, am I, Andrew? Just like you call it as you see it, and to do the same. What people call my brand of economics is neoclassical liberal economics, free market economics, Austrian economics, and
Hayek, in
it's
other words.
Hayekian, and the like. Yes, and so it's
Although
got a. I mean, I lay it all out in the.
we've done some shows on Hayek. I'm not sure Hayek, and there are many Hayeks, and he's no longer around to defend himself. We actually just did a show with Skidelsky on Keynes,
Yes.
and Keynes' thinking, and for Skidelsky, Keynes and Hayek actually were mostly, in his mind at least, mostly in agreement. But that's another issue.
I agree with him.
I'm not convinced, though, John, that Hayek would be against the National Health Service, would he?
Oh, I suspect he would, because the thing that he's against, one of his most famous books is a great book called The Fatal Conceit. And the fatal conceit is the conceit that politicians have that they know best and that they can sort out how things should be. And if you think and it's mostly socialists who feel that way. A very good example of the Chinese, right, from Chairman Mao. So the Great Leap Forward said, melt all your pots and pans and we'll make steel out of them. Turned out, the metal wasn't suitable for making steel out of them. And at the end of that, nobody had any pots and pans. That was bad enough. But then they used, you remember Lysenko, the Russian agronomist, who said, who had a totally batty ideas about how to pass on genetics from one generation of seed to another. That even after Russia had decided it was a crock, the Chinese then went and did it, and tens of millions of Chinese died as a result. And then to cap it all, they had the one-child policy, which has been absolutely catastrophic for them. So that's an example of people thinking we know best, we in the center know best. And that's the idea of socialism. You can have a centrally directed economy.
But in defense, I mean, I don't want to get
Yeah.
too comparative here, but we did a show earlier this week with Andrew Scott, another distinguished professor of economics. He's the world's leading expert on longevity and how long we live. He noted that people in China now live longer than people in the UK. So the Chinese are clearly doing something right. Can't just blame everything on Chairman Mao.
Well, one of the reasons they do so well, I don't even remember, a few years ago, Bill Clinton started to look a lot thinner, and people said, "Why have you lost so much weight, Bill?" And he held up a big book called the China something, the China Syndrome. Big. I read it. It's about 800 pages long. Very interesting book, and it was all about how if you gave up dairy, you'd live longer. And of course, the point is that most Chinese don't eat dairy, so that's one reason they live longer.
Well, I mean, you'll have to have a
But there you
conversation.
are.
But in all
But
seriousness, John, let's get back to this issue of growth, which you address in the first volume of your book, Return to Growth. You have very strong views on the UK. When I ran my question through Google's AI, of course, like everybody else, it talks about long-term UK relative economic decline since the mid to late 19th century. I mean, in the period you're talking about, there's been enormous growth elsewhere, from China to South Korea
correct,
to Taiwan to
correct,
India to the
exactly.
United States,
Yes.
Scandinavian models. Why is it just the UK that seems to be doing so
Well,
badly?
no, actually, the Scandinavian, it's not true. They are said to have grown, but actually, if you look at them, they haven't. No, there's a map of the world relatively early on in my book that shows which countries are growing fast and which aren't. And the ones that are not growing fast are the ones that pursue the so-called social democratic model, that have government spending up at around or near half of the economy. And France, Germany, all of those EU countries. And by the way, the thing that you quoted from on that picture, saying that we're suffering from not being in the EU, that is completely and catastrophically wrong. I can tell you
Yeah, and I
why in
want
a
to get
minute.
to Brexit, of course,
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
few minutes. We're not going to avoid that
But
one.
but the trouble is that the UK, in the past couple of decades, has been attempting to emulate the social democratic model. It's moved, as I say, the size of its government spending from a third of the economy to nearly a half of the economy. It's tried to increase taxes. It's put in more and more regulations, going exactly against what Hayek said. He said, don't have the fatal conceit. Don't think you can order society better than itself. Um, and so, yes, we haven't grown well. The whole of the EU, apart from the very new members over in the east of the EU, has has stopped growing as well. While, as you say, all over the world, those countries that have lower taxes, less regulation, are continuing to grow in a very satisfactory way. And the book points all of that out.
Would that include China? How does China fit into this argument?
Well, China has actually slowed down quite a bit, but China started to grow the moment it started to embrace capitalistic free market principles, and it had very low regulation. Um, but now it's, in the past couple of years, started to squeeze its entrepreneurs and squeeze its billionaires, and suddenly bad. A lot of the growth did come from construction, housing construction, and that's come to an end, which is, one of the problems China's facing. But look at, I would prefer to look at India, which is still
Hmm.
growing like a weed and is doing very, very well. And basically, they let their entrepreneurs get on with things, just like they do for most of the time in America. And America continues to grow at a very satisfactory rate.
Well, let's get to one of the most controversial subjects in recent British history, Brexit. Were you a Brexiteer, John?
Absolutely. Big time. Yes.
And are you still one? Do you think it was a good move?
More so than ever. It's a terrific piece of news. It allows us
Lots of people argue that Britain has declined. If anything, economic decline has been more precipitous since
yes.
Brexit.
Well, that AI page that you that, and it's a magnificent piece of casuistry. You're right. Trade restrictions with the EU, being a decline, blah blah blah. No, the previous one you showed said it was because
Yeah, it says,
we
and
left the
I'm
EU.
quoting AI overview from Google, trade restrictions with the EU since 2021 have contributed to the UK's economic decline. Why is that wrong?
Well, AI claims that. What it's riffing off is a report that said at some point in the future, our economic growth would be 4% lower than it would have been in the EU. And they based this on a so-called counterfactual model. And the counterfactual model has been destroyed. There's a very good paper. I'll remember his name is another professor at Balliol College, along with Mr. Susskind, one of the few who doesn't adopt a left-wing economics point of view, who just pointed out that it's just an imaginary counterfactual. It doesn't actually say that our economy has gone down. It says that it's going to be at some point in 10 years 4% lower than what a counterfactual would predict. So and then AI transfer that into saying, oh, the economy's gone down, it's performed much less well. No, that's not at all what the report said, but it's how people have reported it, who are incredibly keen to stand on the EU. In fact, our
well, you do understand. I think you probably know.
I think they're EU fanboys, and I don't know why, because I think about this. The UK, in study after number 2 soft power in the world, after the US, right? And yet we were required, as part of the EU, to tuck ourselves in under 27 other states, and often had no voice at the table whatsoever in anything. We have, for example, signed with the US now the so-called AUKUS deal, which is a very important defense and security arrangement that's going to protect the West a great deal. We would never have been allowed to sign that if we had been part of the EU. Our exports have taken off around the world, partly because, and this is something, Andrew, I think you'll resonate with. Before we joined the so-called common market, which was called then in 1973, our trade was mostly with the Commonwealth. And people said, oh, well, Commonwealth, tiny little economic area, much smaller than the EU. By the time we got to 2016 and voting for it, whether to leave the EU or not, the Commonwealth had grown to be the same size as the EU. And I would go around giving speeches saying, in 2024 or whatever, way bigger than the EU. And it is. As a trading bloc, it's way bigger. Now, the Commonwealth uses the common law. The Commonwealth uses the English language. The Commonwealth uses all sorts of technologies that we gave them. If you go around the world, you'll see in all these little countries, big countries, Malaysia, Vanuatu, wherever, you'll see the square pin plug. Now you think, okay, we can sell a few square pin plugs to them. But no, it's what's behind those plugs in the wall, an entire 240 volt system that we gave to all these countries around the world that they still have. And so it's much, much easier for us to sell stuff to them, for us to sell stuff into Europe, which has, I'm not sure what it does have, 130 volts or something like that, but a completely different system of electricity that we have nothing. And you can go down sector after sector.
The biggest company I think in the world is Apple, the most valuable, worth over $3 trillion. They produce their electronics in the US, which has a certain kind of plug. I'm not sure it necessarily makes any difference to who wants an iPhone or not. But anyway, John.
Oh no, I'm talking about the generation and transmission of electricity. That huge sector, the stuff behind the wall that you pylons and the power stations and so forth. That's all 240 volts in those countries. It's 120 volts in the US, so we couldn't sell much to them. But that's why it's so much better. And since we've left the EU, our exports to the Commonwealth have taken off like 1% just last year. 23% increase in exports to the Commonwealth, which is a bigger market than the EU. It's total nonsense to think that our best possible market is the protectionist EU versus all these countries that we have enormous ties to.
John, some people will be
I
watching
submit.
this and thinking, here's this conservative lord in his fancy home in Chelsea talking about the benefits of Brexit.
Yeah.
I mean, how much time do you spend out of London? When was the last time you were in Grimsby or Rochdale and seen
No.
the decline, which seems to be even more dramatic after Brexit? Or is that just the left-wing press?
Well, I mean, look, I'm 76 years old and I've made some money in my time. I wasn't always like that.
No,
You
I
know,
take your point,
I
but
had a period when I lived on the street because I didn't have a job
well, okay,
and
I
I
take
didn't
your
have any
point, but
money,
but
and so I think around the UK in the past few months. I go to America virtually every month. I drove a couple of ambulances to Ukraine when the war started, and got involved in some quite desperate scenes out there with the refugees. I'm not some just because I'm a
but back to my
conservative.
point.
I'm a conservative
I didn't
because
mean this as an attack on you personally, but
no, no, no. I know. I know.
but
I'm
going
really
back to
happy for you
Grimsby
to.
or Rochdale or
Yes,
places in enormous
yes,
decline now in the
indeed.
UK.
Yes, yeah. Enormous decline because they are suffocated with. Go up there and you speak to people, and they say things like, "I can't say what I think," and literally
Well,
the
what do they
imposition.
think? I mean,
Well, they're thinking all sorts of things about the latest moral panic nostrums, of which we have, one every year right now, uh, one by one. We're supposed to focus on this or that thing, and the latest one is this idea that Israel is a totalitarian, fascistic. Some amazingly say Nazi state. That we have marches every week in London
yeah,
of
but I'm not sure
people.
that's going to affect economic growth one way or the other. What's your position
Oh,
on
it does
immigration? I
because
mean, one of the
because
areas that
because
some
Jews because
people,
Jews who are great entrepreneurs are leaving this country in
well,
droves.
I'm not sure all Jews are entrepreneurs, John. But
No,
anyway,
I no no I
but let
said
me come
Jews who
back
are
to the
great
question of
entrepreneurs are leaving
immigration. I
this
mean, one of
country.
the big issues, one of the big issues. I mean, Daniel Susskind, of course, is Jewish. He's not an
Yeah,
entrepreneur. He's the author
yeah,
of Growth. But he's one of your left-wing pampered Oxford dons. But coming back
yeah.
to
I didn't
what
say
about
all
immigration?
you
I mean,
you
one
you
you said that people
mischaracterized what I
can't.
said, Andrew. To be fair, you mischaracterized what I said. I said Jews who are great entrepreneurs are leaving this country, and they are, and they're coming to me, and they're begging me as a lord to intervene and complain about what's going on. But
Uh,
Jews in
okay,
this
I
country are
take your
afraid to
point. But
go out into the
let's get
street.
back to you were saying that people aren't able, or you claim that people can't say what they want. A lot of that has to do with immigration. You know that.
Yeah.
What's your position on immigration and growth? Is it good or bad?
I'm fundamentally pro-immigration so long as, first of all, it's people who contribute to the economy, and second, it's not so great as to overwhelm public services, housing, and the like. Because one of the reasons, well, as you were saying, a lot of it's about immigration. A lot of people in those towns that you were that you were naming are seeing that they're not able to get on the public housing provision because immigrants are taking it. They're seeing that the emergency departments of hospitals crowded. They're seeing that they can't get their kid into the school that they want. And I think it's a matter. I'm pro immigration, but right now we have 1.2 million uh, new immigrants every year in a population of 67 million, and that's over 10 million immigrants in a decade, and it just overwhelms our ability for them, particularly since regulations make it very difficult to build new housing in this country. Um, so that's my view. I've worked in refugee camps in my life, and so I'm very, very aware of what it's like to be a refugee and to live completely sympathetic to them. But I think every country has a limit to the amount that it can take in a given year.
John, I wonder, stepping back and looking at all this more broadly in a historical sense, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Gary Gerstle, another economic historian. He's written a very influential book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. Very influential book. He's been on the show several times. You're a proud Hayekian, but is there a nostalgia for the 20th century? I mean, everyone's moved on, including Trump and Vance, who are anything but Hayekian. Are there any free trade Hayekians left except for you?
Well, in country after country around the world, of course there are. The richest country in the world, whose citizens are richest, is Singapore. And that's a highly Hayekian. I think they even quote Hayek quite a bit. Switzerland is the most innovative. They have more innovations per head of population than even America does. They're pretty Hayekian. I think you can go around the world finding a lot of Hayek if you want to look for it. But you're absolutely right. The whole tariff stuff that Donald Trump is coming up with is precisely the opposite of free markets and free trade, which have done an enormous amount to enrich the world.
Well, why then? I mean, if conservatives are turning against free trade, something must have gone a bit wrong. I mean,
Well,
Trump's argument is that America has been taken advantage of. You seem to believe that free trade is free for everyone. For Trump, it's the reverse.
Well, I think that a country like China hasn't played fair. They steal intellectual promise, industrial espionage operation, and so forth. But it's interesting that you call Trump a conservative, because as you know, Donald Trump voted Democrat for most of his life. In the book, I talk about a thing called Wagner's law. And Wagner, this professor in an obscure German university, and in 1865 he pronounced his law, which was, in a democracy, the size of government inexorably increases. And presumably his thought was that if you want to get elected, you've got to promise things to the electorate, and you even have to deliver some of what you promise. And so bit by bit, what government delivers gets more and more and crowds out the private sector. And I think that obsession with tariffs, which he's fixated on more and more, is merely a misunderstanding, or well, not misunderstanding, a misapprehension of good economics. Can I offer we on our side would say about tariffs? He says he's going to stop factories being built in Mexico by putting 200 or 300% tariffs on the cars they build there, and therefore that they'll build the factory in the US. Now, I hope you'll bear with me. If you've got one of which builds a Volkswagen, say in Carolina, and it costs 30,000, and one of which it builds it in Mexico and it costs 20,000, you're an American citizen. If you buy the £20,000 Volkswagen, same machine, you'll be much better off. You'll have $10,000 in your pocket. If Trump puts 100% tariff on that, it'll cost 40,000, and you'll buy the one in Carolina, but you'll have $10,000 less in your pocket. So tariffs damage the American consumer, and that's what Trump hasn't thought through. And of course, by the way, the Carolina Volkswagen plant will probably put its price up to 35,000 if it has no competition left because of Trump's tariffs. Now, tariffs hurt the people in the country that imposes the tariffs over and over again by economists. And Trump has just got that absolutely and awfully wrong. Now, you have to hope that it's just a threat rather than an imposition, because Americans will be poorer if Trump imposes all these tariffs.
Interesting. The two countries you brought up as positive models for free trade are Switzerland, which seems to have, I know, it's an easy argument to make. It seems to have a very unique history. I mean, not very unique. Anything unique is by definition very unique. It's hard to replicate the Swiss model. And then Singapore, which isn't really a democracy. It's a rather nasty place to live in if you're not part of if you don't abide with the conventions of the society. How would you respond, Jon, to that? Is there a potential for authoritarianism in your argument?
I don't think so. I mean, Switzerland is actually pretty annoying to live in if you're like you and me, and we're fairly free spirits. You know, your
Yeah,
neighbor
it's a
will
very
come round.
conformist place, although it is
Yes,
a
exactly.
democracy. It's one of the
Yeah,
models, the pioneers of a certain kind of local democracy, but
exactly.
it's
Uh,
unique.
well, yeah, but think about it, the way it's got to where it is. And, you know, its currency has appreciated against the dollar 3 times in the last less than a decade, which means that those iPads you were mentioning, what it would have cost if they hadn't done what they've done. So they've had enormous economic growth, and they've done it through innovation and constantly trying to go up the value chain and letting their currency float. By the way, you know, they haven't tried to control their currency, so they're great. Singapore is to a degree, but it's not nearly as bad as you might be implying. I don't know. You ever come across someone called Jim Rogers, who
No.
wrote a book, very interesting book called Investment Biker. He went on a motorbike all the way around the world and invested in various books about it, and woke up various sleeping stock exchanges in places like Austria, and he got married. He was over 60, had a couple of daughters, and moved to Singapore. And he's a real free spirit, and he absolutely loves it. And there are plenty of people, you know, who really do enjoy it. It might be a little more conformist than you or me might like, but there are, you know, there's not just those two countries. I mean, amazingly, a lot of people are going to Dubai. And a friend of mine was there last week, and he said he met a conference, met literally hundreds of young Brits who'd all gone there because it's very free. They're very unconstrained,
Well, it's
and
very free. It's very free if you don't want to live in a democracy. It's very free if you want to go to
sure.
certain kind of hotels
But
to
then,
drink.
but
Let me
but
ask
then
you
go
one
to
other question,
Australia.
John, because I know. Sorry, go on.
Everybody's going to Australia, and that's, you know, I'm sure you don't have anything to say against
No,
Australia.
I've certainly got nothing to say. In fact, my
Yeah, yeah.
daughter's going to Australia
There
next
you
week.
go.
Briefly, John, I was in Switzerland. I was in Zurich a couple of weeks ago in Zug with
Right.
some startup people. Struck me an awful lot of Russians there, a lot of
Yeah.
money sloshing around, some of it
Yeah.
probably oligarch money.
Yeah.
How does that? And Britain has a bad reputation as a launderer of overseas money. All sorts of books,
Yeah.
you're all too familiar with that, about the British economy and the city of London being awash in dirty money. How does your argument about the return to growth fit into the way in which so much foreign money, particularly from Russia and perhaps the Middle East, flooded the British economy and didn't seem to benefit most English people, most British people?
Well, it's really got much to do with the subjects discussed in my book. In fact, we've been pretty nasty to Russians since they invaded Ukraine, and quite rightly so, by the way, that we should be nasty to them. I know pretty blameless Russians who are working here who've lost their jobs purely because they were Russian and have been out of a job for a couple of years. And while I feel sorry for them, I'm not. Um, I do think it's good that we have cracked down with unexplained wealth on Russia. I think the world is dividing into two, with the bandit countries like Russia, China, North Korea on one side, and Venezuela, whatever, and the Western world, and it's a very bad thing for the future that this is happening, and it calls for all sorts of actions that in the ideal world I wouldn't want to see, like banning trade to some degree with these countries and generally behaving quite badly to them. But I don't think any of that money before was to do with what I was writing. And now that Labour has banned the status of non-dom here yesterday in the budget, so these Russians you're talking about were all non-doms, and they're all leaving. Few of them,
Well,
much
maybe
less the
some people would
Chinese.
hope that it might make real estate property in London more affordable to first-time buyers. Final question, John. You've been very generous with your time. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm curious what you think about what at least Nicholas Lehman in the New Yorker describes as Bidenomics. He believes that it's starting to transform America through massive high-tech investment, particularly through the CHIPS Act. What do you make of quote-unquote Bidenomics? I'm guessing you're ambivalent. You're probably more sympathetic, though, to Bidenomics than Trumponomics with its focus on tariffs. Isn't there a need for some degree of investment, particularly in high tech?
My gang always says when you hear the word investment coming from a government, you should reach nervously for your wallet, because cash is cash, money is money. The thing to do is to stop government spending so much money. And the idea that the government knows how to invest your money better than you do is for the birds. Now, having said which, the whole chip issue is quite difficult, because if we lose Ukraine, and we might, then Taiwan. And if we have demonstrated that we can't save Ukraine, then the Chinese will decide that we can't save Taiwan. And if we lose Taiwan, then we'll be extremely pleased that there was this major push to get chip manufacturing back into the US. So, when you get to that sort of high jingo, as they call it, consideration, then anything to do with national security, you have to put my kind of thinking aside. National security is the most important. Defense is the most important. Being able to make your own food, to make your own chips, if when the chips are down.
There's a
If I
different
can make
kind
a
of
bad
chips,
pun.
right? There's
Yes,
computer
yes,
chips and chips, English chips.
yeah, yes, but yeah. So I have some sympathy, but at the same time, another reason the American economy is going well is because of Trump's tax reform, which is still working its way through the economy and making it do much better. But elimination of so many regulations, which Biden has not reversed, all of them. So it's a bit of this and a bit of that, as you say. One sometimes thinks a plague upon all their houses. And another point, if you want to be optimistic, you find something good in each of them to applaud.
Final question, John. I'm familiar both with the US and the UK. The one thing that seems to be most absent in the US is any kind of public good. There are very few parks, fewer and fewer pavements. Is there a case to be made, aside from growth, about the public good? How does the public good, whether it's parks, I mean, you've already poo-pooed the National Health Service, you're ambivalent on education. Is there an argument to use government to improve the public good, or do you reject the idea of there being a public good? Mrs. Thatcher famously said that there was no such thing as society. I'm not entirely sure what she meant by that, but
What
would
she
you
meant
kind
was
of
that
agree
it's
with her?
individuals. There's only individuals.
Well, so does that mean that you
There's
shouldn't put
no
money into
abstract thing.
parks or
Say again.
roads?
Parts of it. Well, now, most economists say a thing called core services, which a government should provide, and they'll argue about what falls into that category and what doesn't. But even apart from the most anarchistic kind of person, they'll say that about 15% of the economy should be on that, and a lot of it is about defense, police, that sort of thing. And then you get into issues like health. And I'm not saying people shouldn't have health. I'm saying there are much smarter ways of doing it than we do in our NHS, which, by the way, is killing people. You know, the results of the National Health Service are just awful, and it's going to get much worse in the coming few years. And it's just things like we don't have enough scanners. You know, we have a fraction of the scanners that say you have in America. So now, if you have something wrong with you, Andrew, you can get scanned within a few. The UK, you might have to wait 2 years, by which time your cancer may be so advanced that you might as well not be scanned. And we don't have scanners because a socialistic system will always go on immediate expenditure rather than an investment. But so I veered off the point about you're saying what should government be. You know, some people say that health should be part of it. Other people say it's better to leave the money in people's pockets and look after the poorest people who can't afford it, but everybody else get some private health insurance, and you'll be a lot better off. And that the UK is going now. Before COVID, 10% of the population had private health insurance. Now it's 24% and rising every year because people see that a socialistic health system won't give them health, so they're all going off and getting private health insurance. But how much that should be? If you think of the railways, both in the US and the UK, they built themselves through private enterprise, and they all joined up together without the help of government. You know, you didn't need a government to build the railways, and so forth. But yeah, you know, the
Well,
roads need to be
we could
built.
continue for endless, and we
Yeah.
could talk about the
Yes.
railways. But on the morbid note of people dying, Jon Moynihan, real honor, or author of fascinating new book, Return to Growth, Volume 1, How to Fix the Economy. When are we going to get Volume 2, Jon?
It's released in January, Andrew.
Okay, well, we'll get you back on the show to talk Volume 2, Return to Growth. I'm going to quote you in my conversation in a couple of days with Daniel Susskind. I think he'll have a different take on growth, but we will talk again.
Give him my regards.
I will do. Jon Moynihan, thank you so much. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you.